Welcome everybody to Go Local Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. There's a lot of news this morning. Breaking news on Go Local, a big storm coming, more layoffs at CVS, corporate headquarters up in Woonsocket, just announced today, and a big feature on Hinckley Allen Law Firm, who is one Rhode Island business that is doing well in the home front and also expanding across the country. But I want to go down to the University of Virginia. We have Jennifer Lawless. She is the chair of the Political Science Department. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure.
Okay, let's jump into it. It is not quite 3 weeks, I think, in the Trump second term, and there is no shortage of activities coming out of the Trump White House. Some of the hot button issues that Democrats seem to be most agitated by range from the issues of the immigration policy, this USAID, which I'm guessing 90-something% of Americans have never heard of USAID, as well as other issues including Elon Musk's team taking control of some level of access, I'm not sure it's completely clear, of financial information. Let's start with these three issues. And what should Democrats be focusing on, and how should they be focusing on these issues?
Well, I think one other issue that's really important that spent a lot of time in the headlines this week and that Democrats were able to push back on adequately had to do with Trump's proposal for Gaza and basically floating the idea of ethnic cleansing.
We'll get there. I want to start with these three.
Well, the reason I'm mentioning that is because these other three, which are all obviously very important to Democrats, sort of wound up taking a back seat. It looked like the Democrats were really going to try and push back against the defunding of USAID, even though voters might not know what that is. They do understand the importance of foreign aid. They do understand that something seems fundamentally wrong when there are medications on shelves and doctors' offices and clinics across the globe are no longer allowed to use that medication. And they also understand that something seems wrong when an agency is just shut down and absorbed by the State Department. So I don't know that Democrats and voters in particular have to understand the nuances of what USAID does. They do understand that something seems a little bit off when the president just decides that he's going to shut down agencies. Unfortunately, because the Trump administration says and does things at a crazy pace, the next problem creeps up before there's been an opportunity to put the genie back in the bottle of the previous one. And so I think there was some movement and some pushback against the USAID closure. And then there was the Gaza move, and that basically upended everything else.
Okay. I went to look at, there was an incident at a Republicans fundraiser up here in which the Senate minority leader, Jessica De La Cruz, had a fundraiser, and she's on record supporting the deportation of undocumented immigrants who have committed crimes. That's as far as I've seen her statements go. Protesters attended that event, but then after the event was over, protesters became trolling the employees of the bar that hosted the event, and I guess we're quite aggressive in the social media trolling. I went to see what the percentage of Americans support that policy as defined in that policy, and according to a New York Times poll 3 weeks ago, it was 87% of Americans support the deportation of undocumented immigrants who have committed a violent crime. Are Democrats getting lost in the shuffle as to strategy, and by opposing everything all at once, they're not being very effective because they can't run to which steps to have the press conference?
I don't think so. I mean, first, I would say that 90% of people support gun control, and Republicans have made it their business to ensure that that doesn't get pushed forward. So I don't think that we can just look at public opinion data to gauge what political elites and our elected officials should be doing. What I will say is that what the Trump administration has done very well is put forward a series of policies quickly that target people that are not particularly sympathetic. And so, putting forward an immigration policy that suggests the deportation of criminals is not something that most people are going to be opposed to. Putting forward a policy that is going to lead to the unemployment of a bunch of federal government workers is not something that most people are going to be opposed to. Putting forward a policy, that's going to alienate, isolate, and basically put into danger transgender people across the country. It's a very small sliver, and most people are just not that upset about it. And so I think what we're seeing is a strategy on the part of the administration that makes it difficult for Democrats to make their arguments because these are not particularly sympathetic targets. The problem, of course, is that there are going to be more sympathetic targets as we move forward. And there is going to be precedent now for the administration to just do whatever it wants to do. So that's what's tricky. I think that's where public opinion plays a role here. But, I don't think that the Democrats or the Republicans have ever made their decisions based entirely on whether 87 or 97% of the American people think one thing or another.
Talk a little bit about what the Democratic strategy is right now as a somewhat layperson who is just watching it on cable or network news in small slices and then reading about it in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. It appears to be right now an effort to hold stage press events in front of things and not much else. There hasn't been any shift to any more action. And I understand they don't control the House or the Senate, but the margin in the House is so small. And what I'm surprised at is their inability of Democrats to move Republicans, especially in the Senate, those Republican senators who may not run again, those who may not be up for long periods of time, to be able to move them over and convince them that these really aren't good ideas.
Well, so I would say a couple of things. The strategy is multi-pronged. I think the Democrats have been most successful when it comes to the courts. There are Democratic attorneys general across the country who are working to put basically stays and injunctions in place against a lot of these policies and executive orders that the Trump administration is moving forward. So the courts dealing specifically with what is coming out of the White House seems to be the most effective route that the Democrats are taking at this point. When it comes to Congress, it's trickier. First of all, it's not like major legislation has passed. There have been no bills that have been signed. There have been no major policy shifts that have happened. So it's not that the Democrats and the Democrats are unable to, vote against legislation. It's that the general idea about what legislation would look like that's coming out of the White House is not getting sufficient pushback from Republicans. Now, when it comes to the House, I actually think there are going to be more successes stopping the administration for two reasons. The first is Hakeem Jeffries only needs a couple of people to vote against what the administration wants or what Mike Johnson puts forward. But also, if people are absent, it's impossible for Johnson to get his bill moved forward. And with such a small majority, that becomes a very real problem. The Senate is the biggest disappointment. And I think what you say is exactly right. It is striking to me that there are Republican senators who are either not planning to seek re-election or who are from states that will forgive them voting against Trump's nominees, for example, who are doing it anyway. Susan Collins is a perfect example, but she's not the only one. I don't know what's going on there. I think it's possible that Donald Trump has a hold over Republican senators in a way where at least 3 of them can vote no on anything. J.D. Vance will cast that deciding vote. And, all he has to do is secure that to make sure that 4th vote doesn't go the other way. When you have such polarized elections, when you have such polarized primaries, when you have such polarized politics, it's not clear that there are 4 who are willing to vote. The other thing is, no one wants to be that pivotal vote. It's very easy to get 3 votes against the Republicans because your vote doesn't matter. It's not a big deal if you can get 7 or 8 because it wasn't your vote that matters. But to be that 4th person is a really undesirable position for a Republican senator to be in.
Let's talk a little bit about, I want to go back to immigration. I believe there was a Democratic president not long ago who was nicknamed the deporter-in-chief Barack Obama. And I remember looking it up one time, taking Ronald Reagan's biggest year of deportation against Barack Obama's highest number of deportations in a year. And it was, I believe, I haven't looked at it recently, but I think it was almost 10 to 1. Barack Obama deported 10 times as many as Ronald Reagan did in his highest year. Why was that not an issue then of any significance? I know there was some pushback a little bit amongst advocacy groups, but why is the shift so dramatic?
I think some of it has to do with the fact that when Barack Obama was deporting people, there was not a general anti-immigrant sentiment. He was deporting people because they broke the law and they shouldn't be in the country illegally. He was also emphasizing that we need more border security. The Democrats have since sort of dropped the ball on solid messaging about that. But the rhetoric was not about an inhumane immigration policy. It was not about rounding people up and sending them to prisons. It was not about saying that the people that we're deporting are coming from countries and they're being sent to us from other countries' prisons and insane asylums. Like it was immigration policy that was consistent with the law and what the White House did. And there were critics, to be sure, but what the Obama administration and the White House did was try to follow that law and generate a system such that if you came into the country legally, you could stay, and if you didn't, you couldn't. That changed when Donald Trump came down that escalator in 2015. That all changed, and targeting immigrants, illegal mostly, but not only, in an inhumane way, changed the way that we think about immigration, changed the way that we think about deportations, changed the way that we think about the law, and also sort of pitted us against them. And so over the course of the last 9 years, the whole way that we think about immigration is completely different than it was during the Obama administration. So I think it's about more than just the numbers. It's about the tone with which this administration, and frankly, many Republicans, now want to just throw people out of the country.
Okay, let's go to Gaza. It appeared that it was such an overstep, right, that the United States is going to take over Gaza. It certainly implied that U.S. troops would be involved. It seemed to catch everybody by surprise, including the Israelis. Arab partners who are more moderate immediately reacted against the proposal, and some Republican U.S. senators immediately raised questions about this. What was the strategy there by Trump? There really always does seem to be chaotic strategies about most everything. What was the strategy, and what was the loss for him, but what was the win for him on this?
I don't know, and I can't think about ethnic cleansing in terms of a strategy, and that's what it is. I think he overstepped. The fact that there was such pushback so quickly highlighted that he doesn't understand the way the world works on that front. Like, he doesn't understand that what he said flies in the face, not only of democracy and democratic values, but also of sovereignty in general. Given that Marco Rubio so quickly countered the administration's position on that, and given that so many Republican senators, started tying themselves in knots to try and figure out how they could sound like they still supported Trump, but didn't support basically raising Gaza, highlights that it was a big misstep. Now, I do think that
I think Gaza's already been raised based on all the footage I've seen. I mean, there's functionally does not appear on drone footage that there is very many structures left in the entire territory.
There's a difference between that being the reality and the president of the United States saying that he's going to go in there with U.S. troops, send all of the people that remain to countries like Egypt and Jordan where they don't want to go and these countries don't want to take them. And then he'll basically have the opportunity to develop Gaza consistent with his own real estate ambitions. That's a totally different vision, I think, than the dramatic and very disturbing footage that we've seen over the course of the last year and a half in Gaza to begin with. But what I will say is that by saying those things, he basically has given Netanyahu license to do whatever he wants. If the president of the United States can suggest moving out 2 million Palestinians, there's nothing to suggest that Netanyahu can't do that either. And I think it's dangerous. And it basically, I think for all of those voters who were concerned that Biden and Harris were not sufficiently amenable to Palestinian sovereignty, to all of those voters who thought that a vote for Harris was a vote for Israel, I have to believe that those people are, very, very regretful today.
Well, certainly there seems to be some swing back Arab voters in Michigan who were, arguably the deciding factor in the swing state of Michigan. They had been with Biden very strongly, swung over to Trump very strongly, really left the Biden-Harris administration, now see what potentially the implications of that decision was. I'm not sure how they missed that, but
yeah, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. It doesn't take anything. During the election, it was clear. If you think that the Biden-Harris administration was too cozy with Israel, that's a legitimate position to hold. But you have to consider your alternative, right? You're not considering Harris relative to somebody who might be very pro-Palestinian. You're considering Harris relative to Trump. And so I don't understand what these voters were thinking. And the lack of outrage now is quite stunning to me. Where are the students on college campuses now? Where are all of the voters who were so upset about Biden and Harris in the aftermath of October 7th? Where are they now? I just think that, they realized that there was a big mistake that was made, and they're kind of just going along.
What happens next? What do you foresee in the next few weeks? I mean, as soon as you think he's done writing executive orders, he's got 10 more stacked up on his desk. Are we going to continue to see this pace? And will this continue until de facto Republican senators backlash against, or in the House, Democrats can find an unholy alliance with very, very, very conservative fiscal watchdogs on the Republican side who won't go along with tax cuts and spending?
I think that this pace will continue for a while. The next few weeks will also highlight whether there's any likelihood that there could be resistance in the Senate. I mean, it looks like RFK Jr. is going to get through. It looks like Tulsi Gabbard is probably going to get through. If those two picks wind up getting confirmed, it's hard to believe that there's anything that the Republican Senate wouldn't allow Donald Trump to do. So at that point, all eyes have to be on the House. The other thing that I would say is the Democrats and the Democratic attorneys general have been quite successful in the initial cases they've brought to stop some of the implementation of these executive orders. But all of those decisions are appealed, and they're all going to be percolating up through the court system. Many will ultimately get to the Supreme Court. And at this point, I don't think we should assume that the Supreme Court is anything but a Trump ally.
How are Democrats preparing for the midterm elections, especially in the House, where they have an opportunity to swing the House back? While there's a lot of chaos and a lot of upset, especially amongst Democrats, Trump seems to continue to be very popular in this transition. And the polling is showing that he is maybe more popular than ever before with Americans.
The Democrats have to identify candidates that are right for the specific districts, right? If you look at the elections over the course of the last 5 or 6 cycles, there are only about 30 districts where there are competitive elections. So it's not like the Democrats have to go out and figure out who the best 435 candidates are. They need to look at
You have frozen. Let's give it one more second. We have lost your feed.
who could win not only a primary,
you're back.
but also. I'm sorry?
Oh, you had frozen for a minute there.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I think they have to, identify in a handful of districts Democrats that could actually knock off a Republican. But this doesn't need to be a broad national strategy. This does not have to be a national election. It's not a presidential election cycle. They really just need to identify a handful of districts and knock off a handful of Republicans.
Do they run the risk, though, in these, let's just call it 30, in which they recruit, I'm going to say a more mainstream Democratic candidate, but they face a primary against a much more progressive candidate, is there the danger that the progressive candidate beats the more mainstream candidate and the Republican wins in these swing districts?
Well, I mean, that's the challenge. What they have to do is they have to identify vulnerable Republican incumbents or weak Republican challengers that are coming out there and figure out who could win both a primary and a general election. Because they only have to do this in a handful of districts and they have almost 2 years to do it, if that's where they're laser focused, they should be able to do it. If they try to craft a much broader map, that's where they run into these problems.
Okay, what should we be looking for, over the next week to 10 days? Will it continue at this dizzying pace? And will we see any difference? The big news out of the White House, I think kind of got lost in the shuffle, was Republican leaders were over there with the president discussing the mega bill, which is to try and put absolutely everything, tax cuts, this, that, everything into one piece of legislation, and then force every Republican to vote for it to be able to move it through both the House and the Senate.
That's a very hard task. I think that it's unlikely that that can happen, especially given that they really can't afford to lose any votes in the House. I think for the short term, the more important thing that we can do is look to the Senate and see if they are basically just giving Donald Trump a blank check, because traditionally the Senate has been the chamber where partisans are a little bit more likely to push back against their own president. And thus far, there's no evidence to suggest that Republicans in the Senate are willing to do that.
Professor Lawless, Chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia, always appreciate you taking the time. We have much more. Just to recap, a number of big stories have broken on GoLocal today, CVS, more layoffs, and much, much more. Stay tuned, everybody.